Before you close your eyes tonight, let us drift softly into the past, into the quiet corners of history, where people kept curious treasures close to their hearts. They did not collect for fame or wealth, but often for fascination, beauty, or even a sense of comfort. Each strange object told a quiet story about what people valued, feared, or believed. You may hear the soft sound of parchment rustling, the faint glimmer of candlelight across polished trinkets, or the gentle hush of an ancient market at dusk. In this still, slow journey, we will walk through forgotten rooms, quiet studies, and secret cabinets, places where the oddest collections waited to be admired. From rare stones and animal bones to more peculiar things like hair, tears, or even preserved hearts, every collection reveals something very human. Our need to hold on to moments, to memories, and to meaning. So take a slow breath. Let the day fade. We begin our gentle exploration of the weird things people collected in the past. Section 1. The Curiosity Cabinets of the Renaissance. In the softly lit rooms of the 16th and 17th centuries, a new kind of wonder began to grow. The Cabinet of Curiosities. Wealthy nobles, scholars, and explorers filled these cabinets not with clothes or valuables, but with the strangest things they could find. Each shelf was a quiet mystery, each drawer a story of the world's wonders. The cabinets were not always small. Some were entire rooms, filled from floor to ceiling with carefully arranged oddities. There were shells from distant shores, strange corals shaped like tiny trees, stuffed exotic birds, and bones from creatures no one could name. Many collectors believed these objects revealed the hidden order of nature, that by observing them, one could understand the divine patterns of creation. A visitor entering such a room might feel as if stepping into another world. Candles flickered on ivory carvings, and preserved snakes in glass jars. There might be meteorites, fossilized fish, or miniature mummies from Egypt. Some cabinets even held pieces of unicorn horn, which, in truth, were usually the tusks of narwhals brought from Arctic seas. But the collectors did not mind. The mystery was part of the charm. In Italy, a man named Ferrante Imperato created one of the first great cabinets in Naples. His collection became so famous that people traveled from far and wide just to see it. Drawers opened to reveal polished stones, dried plants, and small animals preserved in oil. On the walls hung strange sea creatures, their fins and shells arranged like ornaments. It was both beautiful and unsettling, a place where nature, art, and superstition met quietly under candlelight. Across Europe, the fashion spread. In Germany, scholars called them Wunderkammern, rooms of wonder. Each collection reflected the mind of its owner. Some were focused on science and study. Others were guided purely by fascination, filled with curious shapes, textures, and colors. For many collectors, these rooms became sanctuaries of thought, peaceful spaces to observe, imagine, and dream. Some items, however, would seem strange today. There were jars containing animal fetuses, bottled scorpions, and pieces of coral arranged to look like miniature forests. Some collectors even kept human remains, skulls, teeth, or dried hands. These were not meant to frighten, but to remind the viewer of the fragility of life and the beauty of creation. In a quiet corner, one might find a dried chameleon, its body frozen mid-motion, or the wing of a bat, carefully pinned and labeled. Nearby, a glass globe might hold the skeleton of a tiny seahorse. Each specimen whispered of a world far beyond the walls of the collector's home. Many cabinets also included artificial curiosities, man-made wonders crafted to surprise and delight. Intricate clockwork toys, crystal spheres etched with designs, or small sculptures carved from bone were placed beside natural relics. This mix of natural and human creation reflected the Renaissance idea that art and science were deeply connected. As evening fell, collectors would often invite friends to view their treasures by lamplight. The group would walk slowly from one shelf to another, speaking softly, as if afraid to disturb the object's delicate balance. They might debate whether a particular shell came from the sea or from the imagination of God, or whether a stone with markings was truly a fossil or simply the result of chance. These rooms were not only for scholars, they were also for storytellers who found inspiration among the jars and specimens. A coral shaped like a hand might inspire a tale of underwater spirits. A glittering rock might be said to hold the soul of a fallen star. Every collection, however odd, became a quiet world of meaning, a reflection of its time and of the people who built it. By the end of the 17th century, cabinets of curiosity evolved into the first true museums. But something gentle and mysterious was lost in that change. The private, candlelit wonder gave way to glass cases and public display. The intimacy of a man sitting alone before his strange treasures, thinking, dreaming, and feeling the mysteries of nature, faded slowly into history. Still, those early collectors left behind something enduring. The idea that to collect is to connect with the world. Through shells, stones, and bones, they reached for understanding, peace, and beauty. The same quiet feelings we still search for today. Section 2. Locks of Love and Bottled Memories. The personal collections of the heart. As the world moved beyond the grand Renaissance chambers of scholars and explorers, collecting became something far more intimate. No longer confined to noble halls or dusty cabinets, the art of gathering odd treasures began to dwell quietly in the hearts of ordinary people, and in the drawers of their writing desks, beneath folded letters and faded ribbons. It was the age of sentiment, and in this time, people collected the strangest things for reasons both tender and tragic. One of the most hauntingly beautiful of these practices was the collection of human hair. To us, it may sound eerie to keep a lock of someone's hair hidden in a small box or bound into a book. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, this was one of the most deeply emotional ways to remember love, friendship, or loss. A single curl might be tied with silk thread, pressed between pages, or woven into intricate jewelry. Some people kept small glass lockets filled with the braided strands of a lover who had passed away. Others gathered entire albums of hair, each lock belonging to a different friend or family member, labeled with names and dates. In an age before photography, hair was a tangible connection, something real, something that once lived and grew with the person remembered. It was a keepsake that could be touched, smelled, or held close to the heart. In quiet evenings by the fire, someone might take out a small locket, open it, and feel the presence of a lost friend all over again. But hair was only the beginning. Some people collected the letters of the dead, keeping boxes filled with handwriting that carried traces of their touch. Others went further still, saving teardrops, quite literally. Yes, some mourners in the 17th and 18th centuries kept what were known as tear bottles. They were delicate glass vials, sometimes adorned with silver or pewter caps, meant to catch the tears shed in mourning. When a loved one died, a person might cry into the bottle over days or weeks, sealing it once the tears had dried. The bottle was then placed beside the grave or kept as a sacred relic. It was said that when the liquid evaporated, the soul of the mourner's grief would ascend to the heavens. There was something both beautiful and sorrowful in this act, the attempt to preserve emotion itself, to turn something invisible and fleeting into something one could hold forever. Some collectors, however, ventured into stranger territory still. A few doctors and natural philosophers of the 18th century began keeping parts of the human body as mementos, not for science alone, but for fascination and sometimes love. A famous example is the story of Jeremy Bentham, the English philosopher, who requested that his body be preserved after death so that he could attend meetings at University College London. His preserved head, at one time displayed in a glass case, became both a curiosity and a source of quiet unease for those who saw it. In the Victorian era, it was not uncommon for lovers or widows to keep tiny urns or bottles containing ashes, or to wear rings holding fragments of bone or teeth, tiny macabre symbols of eternal connection. These items were called memento mori, meaning remember that you must die. But they were not morbid in intent. They were tender, deeply human attempts to make peace with mortality. Another peculiar type of collector emerged in this time, the mourning artist. These were craftspeople who specialized in creating intricate works of art using the hair of the deceased. They crafted delicate wreaths, flowers, and even landscapes, all made from woven strands, arranged in frames and hung in the home. Imagine stepping into a quiet Victorian parlor and seeing above the mantelpiece a tree made entirely of human hair, each leaf a memory, each thread a whisper of someone once loved. And yet, not all collections were born from sorrow. Some came from fascination, the quiet desire to hold something rare and strange. In 18th century Europe, collectors gathered miniature skeletons, animal hearts preserved in jars, and wax models of the human form. These were displayed in curiosity cabinets, alongside seashells, minerals, and artwork, blurring the line between science and sentiment. In aristocratic homes, it became fashionable to show guests small boxes of curiosities, things like ivory teeth, baby shoes, bird skulls, or even a piece of parchment with a royal signature. The stranger the object, the greater the interest. Owning something that had once belonged to another, whether a king, a poet, or a saint, was believed to bring a kind of spiritual intimacy. There were even those who collected mourning postcards depicting cemeteries or weeping angels, often sent between friends as a form of sympathy. Some albums became vast collections of grief and remembrance, filled with dark ink and pressed violets. To modern eyes, these habits might seem melancholy or macabre, but to the people of the past, they were soothing. They offered a sense of continuity, a way to keep love alive, even when life itself had moved on. In the flickering light of a candle, as wind whispered through the curtains, someone might sit quietly, open a small box, and find within it the entire story of a life, a curl of hair, a tear bottle, a letter written long ago. Perhaps if you listen closely, you can still feel the emotion that lingered in those tiny relics, the ache of longing, the softness of remembrance, the human need to hold on to what fades. These collectors of love and loss remind us that the heart, too, is a kind of museum, filled with fragments of people we once knew, the echoes of laughter, the weight of silence, and the gentle beauty of things that once were. Section 3. Stones that bled and beasts that whispered. The collectors of nature's oddities. Long before the tidy glass cases of modern museums, the natural world was not a subject of science. It was a living mystery, something vast and filled with signs, omens, and wonders waiting to be discovered. For many in the ancient and medieval world, nature was a book written by the divine, and every pebble, bone, or feather carried meaning. It was within this enchanted view of nature that some of the strangest collections in history were born. Men and women across centuries gathered the world's curiosities, not to study them, but to feel them, to draw close to their secrets, their strangeness, and their supposed power. One of the most fascinating of these obsessions was with stones. To us, a stone might be nothing more than a lump of earth, but to those who lived hundreds or thousands of years ago, stones were alive. They were said to grow, to breathe, even to bleed. In ancient Greece and Rome, there were collectors of what were known as living stones, geodes and crystals believed to possess a soul. Some philosophers wrote that stones fed on dew or sunlight. Others believed that precious gems formed in the hearts of serpents, hardened from their venom or the fire of their gaze. In medieval Europe, kings and nobles kept cabinets filled with glittering rocks said to cure illness or protect from poison. One of the most prized was the bezoar stone, a strange lump found in the stomachs of goats or camels, believed to neutralize any poison it touched. Monarchs and merchants would pay fortunes for them, sometimes displaying the bezoar as both a trophy and a safeguard against assassination. Collectors also treasured fossils, though they didn't understand what they truly were. When early people found the petrified remains of shells or bones, they often thought they were the relics of dragons, fallen angels, or ancient giants. In medieval England, ammonites, spiral fossils found in cliffs, were called snake stones. According to legend, Saint Hilda had once turned a nest of serpents into stone, leaving behind the coiled shapes forever frozen in rock. Locals collected and polished these fossils, selling them to travelers as holy relics or charms for good luck. The fascination didn't end with rocks. People collected animal remains too, and often for reasons far from scientific. In the dark wooden halls of medieval Europe, collectors kept cabinets filled with claws, horns, and feathers, each with a story. The narwhal tusk, for instance, was one of the most coveted items of the Middle Ages. Sailors from the Arctic would sell them as unicorn horns, claiming they came from magical beasts of purity. Kings paid immense sums for them, believing they could detect poison or grant eternal health. Some royal treasuries had entire rooms devoted to these tusks, long, spiraling relics said to prove that the unicorn was real. Similarly, collectors sought the griffin's claw, which in truth was often a fossilized horn or the claw of a large bird. Medieval knights believed owning one brought strength and courage. Monks, on the other hand, prized feathers from the phoenix, though what they often bought were simply dyed bird feathers from distant lands. In Renaissance Italy, curiosity cabinets grew to astonishing proportions. Wealthy nobles filled them with what they called mirabilia, marvels of the world. Inside one cabinet, a visitor might find a dried lizard sewn to a fishtail, presented as a baby dragon. Beside a petrified egg or a crystal ball containing what looked like a tear from heaven. Each item was a conversation, a mystery, a whisper from a world still largely unexplored. Travelers returned from distant lands, carrying seashells, the size of helmets, the bones of whales, and rocks that sparkled in candlelight. But they also brought the strange and unsettling, mummified hands, the preserved hearts of exotic animals, or dried sea creatures that no one in Europe had ever seen before. These collections blurred the line between the real and the imagined. To the people who owned them, each object seemed to prove that the world was not just vast, it was magical. A fossil was not the bone of a long-dead fish, but a message from another age. A strange rock that glittered under moonlight was not a mineral. It was the breath of the gods made solid. Some even believed these items could protect a household. In small villages, farmers kept unusual stones near their doors to ward off lightning or disease. Sailors carried tiny fossils as charms to keep storms away. A hagstone, a rock with a natural hole through it, was said to allow one to see through the eyes of fairies. The wealthy took these ideas further still. Their collections became private theaters of wonder, rooms lined with velvet where visitors could marvel at nature's strangeness. A nobleman might open a small wooden drawer and reveal a mummified crocodile from the Nile, or a piece of coral shaped like a human hand. Another might show off a stone said to glow under moonlight, claiming it had fallen from the sky. There was even a belief that certain stones could speak. Alchemists in the 16th and 17th centuries searched obsessively for the philosopher's stone, a legendary substance that could transform metal into gold and grant eternal life. Many collectors believed fragments of it already existed, scattered across the earth. They kept these proto-stones, locked in ornate boxes, praying over them, or carrying them in secret pouches for luck. These collections were not just eccentric, they were emotional, spiritual. Each item was a bridge between the human and the divine, between curiosity and faith. To gather nature's oddities was to hold a fragment of creation, to bring a small piece of mystery into one's home. And though centuries have passed, the echo of this wonder still lingers. Even today, when a person picks up a seashell, turns it in their hand, and listens for the ocean trapped inside, they are doing what ancient collectors once did, searching for the extraordinary in the ordinary. Section 4. The Royal Obsession. Kings, Queens, and their Cabinets of Curiosity. Imagine stepping into a royal chamber sometime in the late Renaissance. The air heavy with incense, the light flickering off gold leaf and polished marble. You are led down a hallway lined with velvet curtains and gilt-framed mirrors until you reach a door guarded by silence. When it opens, you step not into a throne room, but into something stranger, a sanctuary of wonder. Shelves climb the walls from floor to ceiling, crowded with objects so bizarre and dazzling that the very air feels enchanted. Welcome to the Cabinet of Curiosity, a king's secret theater of the world. Long before the modern museum, rulers and nobles collected the rare, the mysterious, and the grotesque as a way to express both their power and their curiosity. Their wealth could buy not only armies, but also astonishment. A strange shell from the Indies, a mummified hand from Egypt, or a glass vial of glowing liquid, each item was a message to visitors. The world is vast, and I, the ruler, possess its marvels. One of the earliest and most magnificent of these collectors was Emperor Rudolph II of the Holy Roman Empire. His castle in Prague, around the year 1600, became a labyrinth of art and oddities. He gathered everything that seemed to blur the line between the natural and the supernatural. Among his treasures were mechanical birds that could sing, human skulls carved into drinking cups, and strange stones that glittered with inner light. Rudolph's obsession went beyond curiosity. It became a kind of devotion. He believed that hidden within these objects were clues to the structure of the universe. His alchemists and astrologers roamed the palace, measuring crystals and weighing metals as though each fragment of the earth might whisper a cosmic secret. The emperor's collection became known as a mirror of creation. But Rudolf was not alone. Across Europe, other monarchs followed suit. Queen Elizabeth I of England kept what she called wonders of the Indies, intricately carved coconuts, perfumes from Arabia, and the preserved bones of sea monsters, in truth, whales or sharks. She had even been gifted a mermaid's hand, said to have been found in the waters off Japan. Though most historians now think it was a clever carving of fish skin and bone, assembled by traders who knew what fantasies nobles longed to buy. The French kings, too, indulged in such collections. Louis XIV, the Sun King, filled Versailles not just with art, but with exotic creatures and artifacts. He owned a living menagerie of animals brought from all corners of the world: elephants, ostriches, and a white rhinoceros. But within his palace, he also kept what he called the tokens of the impossible. Among these were shells shaped like angels' wings, crystals that burned without fire, and a stone said to bleed when held in the hand of a sinner. For rulers, such objects were not mere amusements. They were symbols of dominion, proof that even the strangest corners of the earth could be gathered, tamed, and owned. Yet they also revealed something deeply human, a yearning to understand the unknown, to hold wonder itself in one's grasp. These cabinets were also profoundly personal. When Catherine the Great of Russia began collecting oddities, she did not merely order her servants to fetch them. She corresponded with explorers and scholars, requesting rare seeds, fossils, and stones. Her collection grew to include meteorites, bones of mammoths, and even a mummified child from the Nile, said to bring fortune to the empress if displayed on the night of the full moon. Catherine's palace contained hundreds of drawers and glass cases labeled in Latin, Greek, and Russian. One visitor described her collection as a quiet storm of wonders. Everything from tiny hummingbird skeletons to glowing minerals found a place within it. The empress herself once remarked that every object, no matter how small, was a prayer to eternity, a way of seeing the divine order of the world. But not all royal collections were so elegant. Some turned toward the macabre. In the early 17th century, King Christian IV of Denmark kept a collection that astonished and horrified foreign guests. Among his prized possessions were the skulls of executed pirates, polished and gilded. The finger bones of saints kept beside pagan idols, and a tiny coffin containing the preserved heart of a wolf. The king believed the wolf's heart brought him courage in battle, and he was said to sleep with it beside his bed during wartime. Elsewhere, rulers displayed strange mementos of faith and fear. In Bavaria, one duke kept an entire cabinet dedicated to relics of miracles and curses. Dried tears, fragments of burned clothing from supposed witches, even a glass vial labeled the breath of a saint. Not all these collectors sought shock value. Some genuinely saw their oddities as attempts to understand creation. The late Renaissance, after all, was a time when art, science, and mysticism were still intertwined. To own something strange was to be close to the mystery of existence itself. As centuries passed, these royal collections grew into enormous archives. Some evolved into public museums, like the British Museum or the Kunstkamera in St. Petersburg, which began as Peter the Great's personal collection of wonders. Peter's taste was infamous. He filled his halls with preserved malformed fetuses, two-headed animals, and skeletons of sea people, in reality deformed marine creatures. Visitors came from all over Europe to see his bizarre menagerie of the natural and unnatural. To the modern eye, such collections may seem unsettling, even cruel, but to those early collectors, they were acts of curiosity, reverence, and sometimes fear. Each strange object was a question without an answer. Standing inside one of those candlelit rooms, surrounded by jars, fossils, feathers, and stones, you would not feel disgust, you would feel wonder. The quiet hum of strangeness in the air would remind you that the world is older and stranger than you can imagine, and that curiosity, no matter how royal or humble, is a kind of courage. For in those collections, among unicorn horns, dragon's teeth, and glowing stones, humanity revealed one of its oldest truths: that we collect not just objects, but stories. Each item whispers a tale of the unknown, a piece of the vast, living puzzle that is the world. Section 5. Sacred relics and spiritual oddities when faith became a collection. If you stepped into a medieval church on a quiet afternoon, the air would be thick with incense, candle smoke, and whispers of devotion. Somewhere near the altar, encased in gold and glass, you might see something strange: a finger bone, a drop of dried blood, or a withered lock of hair. These weren't macabre trophies. They were relics. Sacred fragments of holy people believed to carry divine power. But in an age where faith and fear walked hand in hand, these relics became more than spiritual reminders. They became collections, carefully curated, fiercely protected, and sometimes even traded like precious jewels. The fascination began early in the Christian world. In the 4th and 5th centuries, churches began collecting the physical remains of saints, bones, ashes, or garments touched by holiness. To own one was to hold a spark of heaven itself. People believed these relics could heal the sick, ward off storms, and protect armies. Entire cities competed for them. When Constantinople, Rome, or Paris acquired a famous saint's relic, processions filled the streets. Bells rang, crowds wept, and candles burned through the night. Soon the act of collecting holy relics became both a devotion and a display of status. A wealthy abbey or monarch might boast hundreds of sacred items, each carefully catalogued and enshrined. The more relics one owned, the greater their perceived favor in the eyes of God. One of the most extraordinary collectors was Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor. He believed that relics anchored divine protection to his empire. His personal treasury was said to contain the cloak of the Virgin Mary, a fragment of the true cross, and even a tooth of St. John the Baptist. His chapel at Aachen became less a place of worship and more a celestial archive, a place where heaven was kept under lock and key. By the Middle Ages, relic collecting had taken on a life of its own. Pilgrims traveled vast distances to see or touch them, sometimes crawling on their knees for miles in hope of a miracle. Merchants realized there was profit in faith, and a thriving trade in relics emerged. You could buy the bones of saints, vials of holy blood, and shreds of angelic feathers, though authenticity was often questionable. There were, quite famously, enough splinters of the true cross sold across Europe to build an entire ship. Still, the belief was sincere. People didn't just collect these relics for beauty. They believed these objects carried real power. Monasteries built entire rooms, called reliquaries, where the air shimmered with candlelight and gold. Behind glass, wrapped in silk, lay bits of bone and cloth, each labeled with reverent care: St. Agnes rib, St. Christopher finger, St. Francis tunic fragment. Some collections were deeply personal. A noblewoman might wear a pendant said to contain a saint's tooth, hoping it would protect her in childbirth. A knight might carry a small bone fragment sewn into his armor, believing it would shield him in battle. A pilgrimage to touch a famous relic could mean salvation, and yet not all relics were so holy. Alongside genuine items, people collected objects that hovered between the sacred and the supernatural. There were vials of tears said to have been wept by angels, stones that glowed when prayers were spoken nearby, and holy thorns said to fall from heaven during storms. One of the most curious examples comes from medieval Spain, where churches collected so-called miracle stones, small pebbles believed to have absorbed divine energy. Worshippers would rub them between their fingers during prayer, then return them to the altar. Over centuries, thousands of these stones accumulated, forming shimmering piles that glowed in candlelight. A quiet sea of devotion. Further east, in the Byzantine Empire, the collection of relics reached almost theatrical levels. The imperial treasury at Constantinople housed objects said to include Noah's Ark's wood, Moses' staff, and a feather from the Archangel Gabriel's wing. Visitors described the atmosphere as half cathedral, half dream. To walk among those relics was to walk through the story of the world itself. Even the Crusaders, marching into the Holy Land, became collectors. After battles, they scoured ruins for anything remotely sacred. Scraps of cloth, broken chalices, or bits of stone, claiming each piece as a relic. These treasures were brought back to Europe and displayed with solemn pride. Entire monasteries were founded simply to house the relics of returning knights. But alongside the reverence came darker practices. Some people began fabricating relics, bones of animals passed off as saints, or dust from ordinary roads sold as earth from Golgotha. The trade became so widespread that even the church struggled to regulate it. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council decreed that relics could no longer be displayed publicly without papal approval. Yet even this did little to stop the flood of sacred curiosities. By the Renaissance, the nature of collecting began to change. People started to see relics not only as holy objects, but also as historical artifacts, windows into the past. Collectors blended faith with curiosity. A scholar might keep a saint's bone beside an ancient coin, or a vial of holy oil next to a fossil. The sacred and the scientific began to share the same shelves. It's easy to smile at such practices today, to imagine how strange it must have been to venerate a scrap of fabric or a sliver of bone. But behind this devotion was something deeply human, the longing to connect with eternity, to hold a fragment of the divine in one's hand. When you think about it, collecting relics wasn't so different from collecting memories. Each object, no matter how small or strange, was a bridge between the visible and the invisible, between the mortal and the eternal. In their soft candlelight and golden cases, these relics whispered that faith, like curiosity, is a kind of collection too. And as centuries passed, though the world grew more skeptical and scientific, that impulse remained. The relics stayed behind, silent in their glass boxes, their stories outliving the hands that once revered them. Section 6. Treasures of the Hearth. The strange things people collected at home. Imagine stepping into the home of a medieval family on a quiet winter evening. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and beeswax. The fire hums low, casting a soft, amber glow on uneven walls. At first, it looks simple. Rough-hewn furniture, a few clay pots, a wooden chest in the corner. But if you looked closer, you'd see something remarkable. A tiny personal museum, hidden among the daily clutter. Long before museums existed, ordinary people kept their own collections. They gathered curious things from the world around them. Stones shaped like hearts, feathers that shimmered strangely, coins worn smooth by time. These weren't random trinkets. To them, each item carried meaning, protection, memory, or quiet magic. In the Middle Ages, homes were often filled with what might seem odd to us today. Beneath a child's pillow might rest a small pouch containing a rabbit's foot or a fragment of coral, thought to ward off evil dreams. Above the doorway, you might notice a horseshoe, polished by years of touch, placed there not for decoration, but for luck. And somewhere in the kitchen, tucked into a small wooden box, could be a bundle of dried herbs, rosemary, sage, and lavender, tied with red thread to keep illness away. For many families, collecting such objects was a way of anchoring safety in a world that felt unpredictable. Life was fragile, medicine uncertain, and faith mingled easily with superstition. A smooth stone found beside a river might be kept for years simply because it felt good in the hand. Some items were passed down through generations, becoming heirlooms of comfort rather than wealth. A grandmother might gift her granddaughter a silver spoon said to cure sorrow, or a piece of amber that glowed like honey in the light, believed to protect against fever. These things weren't valuable to anyone else, but to the family, they were priceless. One of the most fascinating examples of domestic collecting comes from Northern Europe, where families kept what were called house spirits tokens. These were small offerings, buttons, shells, or bits of cloth, gathered and hidden behind hearthstones or under the floorboards. They were meant to please the invisible household spirits that, people believed, protected the home from harm. If someone fell ill or crops failed, the family might search for more tokens to offer, small objects carrying big hopes. In some English cottages, people even collected witch bottles. These were curious glass containers filled with pins, nails, salt, and hair. They were buried near doorways or fireplaces to trap malevolent forces. Though the practice sounds grim, it came from the same impulse that drives all collectors, the desire to shape the world through what we keep close. Children, too, had their own treasures. A child in the 14th century might hoard shiny pebbles, broken pottery, or bits of colored glass. In ancient Rome, children collected small figurines or nuts carved with faces. The simplest joys turned into keepsakes. The instinct to collect begins early in life, born from curiosity and wonder. Even the wealthy, in their stone manors or townhouses, shared this habit, though on a grander scale. They collected exotic objects from distant lands, porcelain from China, ostrich eggs from Africa, and coral from the Mediterranean Sea. These items were displayed proudly in small cabinets, the ancestors of what would later become the Cabinet of Curiosities. Yet even in these rich homes, the impulse was the same, to surround oneself with things that told stories. In a way, every object carried a whisper of the past. A chipped cup might remind its owner of a loved one. A dried rose might mark the day of a wedding. These were not trophies. They were fragments of memory, little anchors that kept the past alive. Sometimes, the objects themselves were thought to hold mysterious energy. In old Slavic traditions, people collected stones with natural holes, called hag stones. Hung near beds or worn around the neck, they were said to let only good spirits pass through their holes. To own one was to carry a piece of protection, found by chance but kept with care. In Japan, during the Edo period, even common households kept collections of oddly shaped gourds or shells, believing them to attract fortune or happiness. A perfectly symmetrical shell was a sign of balance in the household. A twisted one warned of coming mischief. Across cultures and centuries, the pattern is the same. To collect is to care, to notice, to assign meaning. Long before museums categorized the world, ordinary people built their own quiet sanctuaries of wonder inside their homes. When travelers visited one another, they sometimes exchanged these personal relics, a feather, a coin, a small charm, as tokens of friendship. And when someone died, their collection often stayed behind, tucked in drawers or chests. Later generations might find them and wonder, what did this stone mean? Why did she keep this button? The answers faded, but the tenderness behind them remained. Even now, archaeologists uncover such collections, small piles of shells, bundles of herbs, boxes filled with carved bones, and though centuries have passed, they still radiate something intimate. They tell us that, in the quiet corners of life, people have always found comfort in the act of gathering and keeping. Each of those ancient domestic collections, however humble, was a reflection of something deeply human, the desire to turn the uncertain world into something familiar, to hold beauty in one's hands and say, "This is mine, and it matters." Section 7. The King's Curiosities, Royal Collections of the Strange and Spectacular. Throughout history, rulers have had the power to shape their world, not only through armies or decrees, but through the objects they chose to keep. Their collections were mirrors of their minds, reflections of what they found wondrous, mysterious, or divine. Yet some of the things kings and queens gathered were not jewels or gold, but curiosities so odd they bordered on the unbelievable. Imagine stepping into a royal chamber in the 16th century. Not a hall of marble, but a private room filled floor to ceiling with glittering shells, preserved animals, strange stones, and ancient bones. This was not chaos, but curiosity made visible. To the rulers of Europe and beyond, collecting was a way to make sense of the vast, wild world. The tradition of these curiosity cabinets began long before museums existed. In Italy, the Medici family filled secret rooms with fossilized fish, fragments of coral, and carved ivory skulls. They believed these items revealed the hidden order of God's creation, that every shell, every bone was a clue in a divine puzzle. A visitor might find themselves staring at a tiny, preserved hummingbird beside the jawbone of a whale, both equally sacred in their strangeness. across the Alps, the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II created what may have been the most eccentric royal collection in Europe. In his Prague castle, entire rooms overflowed with peculiarities: mechanical birds that sang when wound, preserved snakes in jars of oil, astrological instruments, and even what he claimed was the horn of a unicorn. In truth, it was likely a narwhal tusk from the Arctic, sold by sailors who knew a good story could multiply its price. Rudolph believed that understanding the mysteries of nature, even the bizarre, brought him closer to mastering it. His obsession with collecting bordered on mystical. Alchemists, inventors, and artists all contributed to his collection, which blended science and superstition in equal measure. To him, a stuffed crocodile from Egypt and a crystal sphere carved in Venice were part of the same truth: the universe's grand and bewildering design. In England, centuries earlier, King Henry VIII also kept a collection that blended curiosity with power. Among his royal treasures were not just gold and jewels, but weapons shaped like dragons, gilded armor engraved with strange beasts, and even preserved body parts of exotic animals brought from distant lands. These were trophies of conquest, but also symbols of a world that was opening wider and stranger with every voyage. By the 17th century, collecting had become an art form for the elite. King Charles I of England filled his palace with paintings by Titian and Raphael, but tucked among them were fossilized ammonites, shells shaped like human ears, and crystals that looked like frozen lightning. When visitors came to court, they were led not only through halls of politics and power, but through a theater of wonder, where nature and imagination performed side by side. Yet not all royal collectors confined themselves to beautiful things. Some sought what others feared. The French Queen Catherine de' Medici, known for her fascination with astrology, was said to keep mummified animals, strange stones inscribed with runes, and the preserved hearts of small birds in glass jars, objects she believed gave insight into fate itself. Further east, in the Ottoman Empire, the Sultan's palaces were filled with items brought from across 3 continents: carved jade bowls from China, ostrich eggs the size of helmets, and even miniature mechanical clocks that ticked endlessly, mesmerizing guests. But perhaps most intriguing were the specimens of nature gone awry: 2-headed animals, twisted horns, and oddly shaped fruits, all kept as signs of divine mystery. One of the most fascinating royal collections came from the Scandinavian courts in the 1600s. King Frederick III of Denmark established a cabinet of curiosities that became one of the earliest public museums. Among its displays were a giant whale rib, a taxidermied bird of paradise, and a wooden carving of a mermaid said to have been found off the coast of Iceland. People from across Europe visited, marveling not only at what was displayed, but at the idea that such wonders could be gathered in one place. These royal collections were more than hobbies. They were performances of power and imagination. To own a piece of the unknown was to control it, even symbolically. Monarchs saw themselves as keepers of the world's mysteries, their collections serving as microcosms of creation, shrines to both divine craftsmanship and human curiosity. But behind the grandeur, there was something deeply human, the same impulse that once led a peasant woman to keep a lucky stone or a carved charm. The royal collections were simply grander versions of the same yearning: the wish to understand, to possess, and to be surrounded by meaning. As centuries passed, many of these collections formed the foundations of modern museums. The British Museum, for example, began as the private collection of Sir Hans Sloane, physician to the king. His rooms were filled with over 70,000 curiosities, coins, shells, insects, and artifacts gathered from around the world. He believed, as many collectors before him did, that studying the strange helped reveal what it meant to be human. Looking back, it's astonishing how these early collectors blurred the lines between art, science, and myth. In their halls, a stuffed bird and a carved saint could share the same shelf. A meteorite might sit beside a crystal skull. Everything had its place. Everything had a story. And perhaps that's what makes their collections so enduringly fascinating. They remind us that wonder itself was once a form of power. The kings and queens of the past didn't just rule through armies or crowns. They ruled through their ability to imagine, to marvel, and to see magic where others saw only the ordinary. Section 8. Voyagers' Treasures, the strange souvenirs of explorers and sailors. Long before the world was mapped and measured, the seas were vast, unknowable realms, places where imagination often traveled faster than the ships themselves. And the people who braved those waters, explorers, merchants, and sailors, became the messengers of wonder. They returned home not only with spices and silks, but with objects so strange and marvelous that they seemed to defy the natural order. When an explorer returned from distant shores, his ship's hold might contain more than cargo. It held whispers of the unknown. Among barrels of pepper and bundles of exotic wood were things that puzzled even scholars. Enormous shells that sounded like the sea when held to the ear, bones of creatures no one in Europe had ever seen, carved idols from islands so remote they seemed to belong to another world entirely. In the 16th and 17th centuries, during the Age of Discovery, collecting became a kind of storytelling. Each object carried a tale, a fragment of the faraway, proof that there were still mysteries left in the world. A sailor might return with a dried blowfish, inflated like a balloon and spiked like a weapon. Another might sell a preserved lizard or a monkey dressed in human clothing, claiming it was a miniature forest spirit. Many of these strange souvenirs found their way into curiosity cabinets, filling the homes of nobles, scientists, and kings. But their origins were often humble. On the decks of ships, sailors collected curiosities not out of scientific interest, but from wonder and superstition. A coral branch might be kept as a charm against storms. A shark's tooth might be worn as protection from evil spirits. Even the smallest shells could be turned into amulets, passed hand to hand as tokens of luck and survival. It was common for sailors to gather what the sea offered freely: driftwood carved by unknown hands, glass beads traded from one port to another, feathers from birds that followed the ships. These became relics of journeys that might never be repeated, for many who faced the dangers of the ocean. Collecting was a way to hold on to something solid in a world of shifting tides and endless horizons. But among these personal keepsakes were also objects that transformed the way people thought about nature and the human imagination. When Hernán Cortés sent strange items back from the Aztec Empire, feathered headdresses, gold masks, and jade figurines, they seemed to come from a civilization of myth. Scholars in Europe puzzled over them, unsure whether they were real or the work of enchantment. Similarly, when explorers brought back animals like armadillos, sloths, or parrots, people could hardly believe such creatures existed. Many early naturalists tried to fit these discoveries into the framework of medieval bestiaries, where each animal had a symbolic meaning. A parrot was not just a bird. It was a creature that echoed human speech, blurring the line between nature and soul. A sloth, slow and dreamy, became a symbol of laziness and divine patience. Some of the strangest collected objects were entirely misunderstood. Narwhal tusks were believed to be unicorn horns. Coconut shells were mistaken for petrified skulls, and preserved lizards sewn together with fishtails were presented as mermaid corpses, their glassy eyes staring eternally through murky jars. Sailors sold them to tavern owners or scholars eager to own a piece of the impossible. One famous example was the so-called Jenny Hanover, a small, grotesque creature made from the dried body of a stingray, trimmed and shaped to look like a tiny demon or dragon. For centuries, these were sold in ports from Antwerp to Venice as proof of sea monsters. Even serious collectors, including scholars and physicians, displayed them proudly beside fossils and ancient relics, uncertain where myth ended and reality began. These traveling collections also gave birth to the first public exhibitions of wonders. In the 17th century, traveling shows appeared in Europe, displaying preserved crocodiles, ostrich eggs, shrunken heads, and other curiosities from the colonies. People lined up to see these things, half terrified, half delighted. To them, these were not mere objects. They were portals to worlds they could never visit. Explorers themselves often became obsessed with their own collections. The British naturalist Sir Joseph Banks, who sailed with Captain Cook, filled entire rooms with plant specimens, bird skins, and bones. Each piece was carefully labeled and described, but behind the scientific order, there was still a quiet awe, a sense that the earth was far larger and stranger than any book could capture. In Japan, collectors of the Edo period gathered their own curiosities. Inspired by travelers and scholars, they called their small collections rangaku objects, blending foreign science and wonder. Tiny magnifying glasses, shells from the Pacific, and European maps were displayed like sacred treasures, symbols of knowledge and mystery combined. Meanwhile, sailors who returned home poor often sold their finds at seaside markets. Children would gather around to stare at dried seahorses, coral fans, or monkey skulls. For a few coins, anyone could own a fragment of the unknown, a piece of a faraway dream. In a time before photography or global travel, these objects were windows into imagination itself. Even today, when we visit museums filled with ancient shells or faded maps, we are looking at the remnants of that age of wonder. Every label, every object behind glass once passed through a human hand that trembled with discovery. Every specimen once lived in a box, a trunk, or a sailor's pocket, carried across oceans for reasons no one could fully explain, except that it stirred something deep and wordless in the soul. These old collections remind us that the desire to collect is not about ownership. It's about connection to the world, to the unseen, and to the stories that objects carry with them. The explorers and sailors of the past may not have understood every artifact they found, but in gathering them, they preserved something precious, the feeling of wonder itself. Section 9. Superstitious collections, charms, relics, and bottled spirits. If you lived in the Middle Ages, your home was not complete without something to protect it. A charm, a relic, or perhaps a bottle that held a whisper of power. In a world where storms, sickness, and fate felt unpredictable, people gathered not only useful objects, but also the invisible ones, the kind believed to guard, bless, or curse. These weren't just decorations, they were survival. One of the most mysterious collections of the medieval world was that of holy relics. Churches and even small villages competed to own them. for relics were thought to bring both spiritual and material fortune. Inside gilded boxes lay bones, fragments of robes, drops of supposed holy blood, even entire bodies preserved in glass coffins. Pilgrims came from far and wide to see them, and towns grew wealthy from the flow of the faithful. But not all relics were grand or genuine. Some were strange, almost absurd, like the feather said to be from the Archangel Gabriel's wing, or the vial that claimed to hold the Virgin Mary's milk. Others were deeply unsettling, such as Saint Ursula's 11,000 fingers, which crowded into reliquaries across Europe, despite there being only one saintly body to begin with. Collectors of relics were often noble patrons or monks, yet their curiosity bordered on obsession. They saw these sacred remains as direct conduits to the divine. But behind the gold and incense, there was also something deeply human. The same impulse that drives people to hold on to souvenirs today. To touch a bone or a fragment of cloth that once belonged to holiness was to feel less alone in a dangerous world. Beyond the walls of cathedrals, ordinary people kept their own small collections of protection. In the dark corners of cottages, tucked behind beams or under beds, were witch bottles, glass vessels filled with pins, nails, hair, and sometimes urine. They were buried near doors or hearths to trap curses before they could enter. To modern eyes, they seem eerie, but to those who made them, they were armor against unseen enemies. These bottles were sometimes found centuries later, sealed and hidden, their contents rusted but intact, small time capsules of fear and faith mixed together. Archaeologists have found them across Britain and parts of Europe, each one a silent story of a family's attempt to keep the unknown at bay. And then there were amulets and talismans, collected like precious heirlooms. Sailors carried bits of coral or bone to protect them from drowning. Farmers tied carved wooden charms to their cattle to prevent disease. Even kings wore protective jewels inscribed with verses or symbols, not as decoration, but as invisible shields. In Egypt, ancient amulets were made from faience and shaped like the eye of Horus or the scarab beetle, symbols of rebirth and divine sight. These objects were sometimes placed on the body of the dead, meant to guide the spirit safely through the afterlife, but the living also carried them, believing the small figures pulsed with the power of gods themselves. During the Renaissance, collectors sought not only religious relics, but also occult curiosities, crystals, fragments of meteorite, bones carved with alchemical symbols. Scholars like John Dee, Queen Elizabeth's astrologer, owned entire cabinets of magical tools, obsidian mirrors, engraved talismans, and scrolls filled with angelic writings. To them, the universe was alive with hidden meaning, and objects were keys that could unlock it. Not all superstitious collections were noble, though. Among villagers and wanderers, there were humbler, earthier practices. A common charm in parts of Europe was the witch's heart, a dried toad sewn into a small pouch, carried for luck or hidden beneath the threshold of a home. Black cat bones were boiled to create charms that could supposedly grant invisibility. And in some regions, people collected thunderstones, ancient stone axes or fossils, believing they were pieces of lightning fallen from the sky. Collectors of these items often didn't see themselves as magical. They were simply careful. In an age where medicine was uncertain and nature unpredictable, it was safer to believe in a charm than to trust chance. Every object, a nail, a feather, a bit of salt, could be part of a quiet ritual that promised safety. Even into the 18th century, travelers wrote of small villages where families passed down their talismans like sacred heirlooms. A grandmother's charm against illness might hang above a baby's cradle. A fisherman's lucky stone might be rubbed before each voyage. These were not museum pieces, but living relics, personal, intimate, and endlessly reinterpreted. In some cases, collections of relics and charms grew into entire museums of superstition. In Germany and Italy, curious nobles displayed not only natural wonders, but also magical ones. Bones of supposed giants, bottles of cursed air, or mummified hands used by thieves to steal unseen. Visitors marveled and trembled at once, unsure whether to laugh, pray, or run. The most fascinating part of these collections is not their superstition, but their sincerity. To us, a witch bottle or a carved talisman might seem like a relic of ignorance, yet to the people who made them, they were symbols of hope. When the world felt vast and unexplainable, they created meaning from what they could hold in their hands. Each bottle buried, each charm worn, was an act of quiet faith, not only in gods or spirits, but in the possibility that the world could still be shaped by intention. And that is something deeply human. The need to believe that through small acts, through objects charged with meaning, we can push back against the chaos of life. Today, those ancient collections rest in museums or hidden beneath old houses, their power long forgotten. But sometimes, when you see one, a bottle sealed with wax, a charm worn smooth by touch, you can almost sense the heartbeat of the person who made it, whispering across centuries, "Be safe, be protected, be seen." Section 10. Collectors of the Soul, when objects were thought to hold life itself. Throughout history, some collectors didn't gather for beauty or prestige. They collected for something far stranger. They believed the objects themselves were alive, not metaphorically, but truly. That a lock of hair could carry memory, that a skull could whisper prayers, that a carved idol could hunger for devotion. These were the collectors of the soul, and their passion blurred the lines between life, death, and faith. In the ancient world, the boundary between a person and their possessions was faint. Among the Egyptians, for instance, objects placed within tombs were not symbolic. They were extensions of the person's spirit. A comb, a cup, or a wooden servant figurine wasn't just buried as decoration. It was believed to awaken in the afterlife and serve its owner. The rich filled their tombs with armies of Ushabti. Figurines, tiny, detailed workers crafted to plow fields, bake bread, and carry water in eternity. These collections, entombed for thousands of years, were not displays of vanity. They were insurance, a guarantee that life in some form would continue. The living soul, the Ka, could inhabit these objects, breathe through them, and find comfort in their familiar shapes. Even a simple mirror or amulet might hold a fragment of one's essence. The Greeks and Romans inherited this belief, though in subtler ways. In ancient Greece, it was common for mourners to keep a lock of hair from the deceased, preserved in small jars or woven into jewelry. This hair was not just a keepsake. It was thought to contain the person's energy. To keep it near was to keep part of them alive. The Romans, too, collected objects touched by their loved ones, rings, clothing, or even the ashes of their pets, and treated them with reverence. But there were darker collections, too. In medieval Europe, where faith and fear intertwined, the obsession with sacred remains grew intense. Kings, abbots, and nobles sought to own relics of saints, believing their bones still pulsed with divine power. The skull of Saint John, the finger of Saint Catherine, the blood of Saint Januarius. Each was guarded like a living treasure. Some relics were encased in gold, others built into jeweled statues, with glass windows showing fragments of flesh or bone. The collectors, bishops, monarchs, even popes, sometimes competed fiercely to acquire them, not just for status, but because these objects were believed to radiate miracles, to heal, to protect, to ensure victory in battle. Owning a saint's relic was like owning a piece of heaven itself. In some cathedrals, the faithful believed the relics would move of their own accord when the saint's spirit was pleased. There are accounts of mummified hands bending in blessing, or bones that exuded fragrance like flowers. To us, it sounds like myth. But to those who witnessed it, it was evidence that the line between body and soul was porous, that even in death, something of the person lingered. Not all collectors were holy. In Renaissance Europe, scholars fascinated by alchemy and the occult began to gather magnetized objects, items said to hold psychic or spiritual force. They kept stones struck by lightning, dried hearts, and pieces of mummified flesh, believing they contained elemental life. Some alchemists even sought to create their own homunculi, tiny artificial beings born from mixtures of blood, metal, and mystic fire. The philosopher's cabinet became a world of whispering things, jars, relics, and bones that were never quite still. The idea that matter itself could carry memory or emotion laid the foundation for centuries of superstition, even as science grew. In far-off lands, similar beliefs blossomed in entirely different forms. In Japan, there were tales of tsukumogami, everyday objects, like fans or sandals, that came to life after 100 years of faithful use. A treasured teapot might awaken, angry or kind, depending on how it was treated. Such stories were warnings about respect, not for wealth, but for longevity and care. Even the smallest thing, the stories said, could harbor a soul if only it were loved long enough. And in parts of Africa and the Pacific Islands, sacred statues called fetishes were believed to hold powerful spirits. These weren't idols of worship in the Western sense, but vessels of energy, filled with herbs, blood, or carved symbols that fed the entity within. Collectors and priests cared for them, washing them, whispering to them, as if tending to living beings. The theme, across all these ages and continents, is strikingly human. We want the things we love, or fear, to outlast us. We want to believe that touch can leave a trace, that something of us can remain in the objects we shape. Even in modern times, echoes of this ancient collecting remain. Museums quietly display saints' bones, amulets, and preserved hearts under glass. Some people still keep locks of hair, childhood toys, or worn jewelry, things that hold, in some ineffable way, a fragment of identity. We may not call it a soul anymore, but the emotion is the same. There's a haunting beauty in it. Imagine holding a simple object, a ring, a mirror, a scrap of parchment, and feeling it hum faintly in your palm, as if some unseen life still stirs within. For the collectors of the soul, that hum was real. Their cabinets and crypts were not filled with things, but with presences, each whispering a story that refused to end. In the end, these ancient collections remind us that the human relationship with the material world has always been spiritual. We gather not only what we see, but what we feel. We hold on to things not because they are useful, but because they echo. And sometimes, when we stand before an old relic in a silent museum, that echo still finds us. A pulse from another time, a quiet reminder that even objects, too, can remember. Section 11. Nature's Oddities. When collectors preserved life itself, long before science separated the living from the dead, many people believed that nature itself could hold power if only it were carefully preserved. Some collectors sought not gold or jewels, but fragments of life that seemed extraordinary. Birds with iridescent feathers, the wings of butterflies, preserved frogs, or rare plants were not mere curiosities. They were thought to contain the essence of vitality, energy that could be observed, harnessed, or admired. In Renaissance Europe, naturalists and scholars often kept what they called cabinets of curiosities. These were carefully arranged collections of unusual plants, minerals, shells, and preserved animals. A rare beetle, a strangely shaped seed pod, or the dried skeleton of a small bird could be displayed with great pride. They believed that by observing and keeping these specimens, they could glimpse the underlying patterns of life itself. Some thought that a perfectly preserved butterfly wing might still flutter in spirit, if not in body. Collectors went further, sometimes preserving creatures in jars of alcohol or brine. Tiny frogs, fish, or lizards were suspended in liquid so their forms remained intact, their shapes frozen in time. The careful act of preservation was almost a ritual. They whispered over the jars, adjusted the specimens with delicate tools, and kept detailed notes on each item. Every creature, though no longer living, was thought to hold traces of vitality. In Japan, similar ideas existed with the art of tsukumogami, where objects that had been used and cherished long enough were believed to gain a spirit. Some collectors believed that by preserving the natural world, leaves, insects, feathers, they could invite these subtle presences into their homes. The meticulous arrangement of each specimen was as much about respect as curiosity. Some collectors specialized in plants with unusual properties. Rare herbs, mosses, and fungi were dried and pressed in books, sometimes mixed with oils or powders. They were thought to capture not only the shape, but the spirit of the plant. Certain flowers, if carefully preserved, were believed to retain their magical or medicinal properties long after being picked. A pressed violet could calm the mind. A preserved fern could bring protection. In this way, the act of collecting became a quiet meditation on life itself. Animal parts were also collected with great care. Some cultures preserved claws, teeth, and even entire small skeletons. The Vikings, for instance, sometimes kept the bones of prized animals as reminders of hunts and victories. These bones were not just trophies, but were believed to carry part of the animal's strength. In other regions, shamanic traditions preserved animal parts to honor the spirits of the creatures. Feathers were kept in bundles, hides were tanned and displayed, and even horns were polished and treated as sacred objects. Collectors also valued the unusual, deformities, rare colors, and strange patterns. A two-headed snake, a spotted bird, or a shell with an irregular spiral would be treasured. These items were seen as windows into the extraordinary designs of nature. To hold such an object was to hold a small miracle, a tangible connection to a larger, mysterious world. In European cabinets of curiosities, human oddities were sometimes collected alongside natural ones. Hair from infants, teeth, or even preserved fingers of saints were kept in glass cases. while unsettling to modern eyes. These objects were treated with care and reverence. They were believed to hold traces of life and spirit, much like the preserved animals and plants. The act of collecting itself was often meditative. Scholars, nobles, and even children would spend hours arranging, dusting, and cataloging each item. Notes were taken on size, color, and origin, and careful sketches were made. In some cases, the collector believed that handling the objects could transfer some subtle energy to them or from them. The preserved life was not dead in the eyes of these collectors. It was paused, waiting, silent but potent. Some collectors were motivated by curiosity, others by superstition, and others by the desire to understand the natural order. But in all cases, the objects held significance beyond their appearance. They were reminders that life, however fragile, could leave traces. Even in stillness, they whispered lessons about care, observation, and the passing of time. This fascination with preservation echoes today in museums and natural history collections. Though we now understand biology and ecology, the wonder remains. A butterfly pinned in a display case still draws the eye. A tiny skeleton, carefully mounted, sparks questions and imagination. In a quiet museum hall, one can almost feel the centuries of care and attention. The reverence for life in its many forms. The collectors of old remind us that human fascination with life's mysteries is timeless. They treated the smallest leaf, the tiniest feather, or the most fragile skeleton with care, reverence, and attention. In doing so, they preserved not just objects, but stories, observations, and an unspoken dialogue with the natural world. And so, in a quiet room, surrounded by jars, shells, and pressed plants, it is easy to imagine the whispers of life that once filled the world. These collectors were not merely hoarding curiosities. They were holding pieces of life itself, fragile reminders of the beauty and strangeness of the living world. Section 12. Curiosities of the Human Body. Medical oddities and preserved specimens. Throughout history, people have been fascinated by the human body, both for its ordinary functions and its extraordinary quirks. Ancient collectors, scholars, and physicians often sought to understand the body by preserving unusual or remarkable specimens. Sometimes these were parts of the body that seemed rare or different: extra fingers, unusual teeth, or strange formations of bone. In many cultures, these specimens were considered both educational and magical. They offered insight into life, mortality, and the mysteries of human nature. In medieval Europe, medical schools and hospitals began keeping anatomical specimens for study. Bones were carefully cleaned and sometimes labeled with chalk or ink, while preserved organs might be stored in jars filled with alcohol or oils. These preserved objects allowed students to learn without relying solely on dissection, which was often limited by religious or cultural rules. Even small specimens, like a malformed hand or a peculiar skull, could teach lessons about anatomy, heredity, and illness. Scholars recorded detailed notes on the shape, texture, and color of each item, noting what was normal and what was unusual. Some collectors were intrigued by congenital anomalies. People with extra fingers, missing limbs, or unusual facial features were sometimes depicted in drawings or preserved as wax models. Wax was used to create lifelike representations of rare conditions, allowing observation without disturbing actual human bodies. These models were displayed in cabinets or lecture halls, and served as both medical teaching tools and objects of wonder. A careful observer might spend hours studying the curves of a hand, the angles of a skull, or the folds of unusual skin formations. Each detail revealed something about the complexity and variability of human life. In other cases, entire bodies or large body parts were preserved for religious or cultural reasons. Saints' relics, for instance, were often treated with extraordinary care. Bones, hair, or teeth were encased in ornate containers, sometimes gilded or jewel-encrusted. These relics were considered sacred, believed to carry spiritual power or protection. Though different in intent from medical collections, the care and attention paid to these preserved human parts mirrored the curiosity and reverence seen in anatomical collections. The line between science, superstition, and devotion was delicate and fascinating. Oddities of the human body were sometimes preserved for entertainment as well. During the Renaissance, some wealthy patrons displayed mummified infants, conjoined twins, or other rare human phenomena in cabinets of curiosities. These displays were treated with care, but also served as conversation pieces. Visitors would marvel quietly, studying each specimen, often imagining the life it once had. Despite the macabre appearance, the objects were handled respectfully, cleaned, and carefully mounted. They represented the interplay between curiosity, wonder, and the desire to preserve what might otherwise be forgotten. In other cultures, medical oddities were believed to hold special powers. In Japan, for instance, mummified or preserved body parts were sometimes thought to carry protective qualities or bring good fortune. A small preserved hand, carefully lacquered and decorated, might be kept in a home or shrine. Similarly, in parts of Africa and the Middle East, certain preserved body parts were believed to aid healing, ward off illness, or protect the family. The act of preservation, gentle handling, and respectful storage was considered essential to maintaining the item's potency. Even in early modern Europe, curiosity about the human body extended to everyday people. Midwives, physicians, and scholars often kept unusual placentas, preserved umbilical cords, or other neonatal specimens. These objects were believed to reveal secrets about health, fertility, and destiny. Detailed notes and sketches accompanied the specimens, documenting shape, texture, and any peculiarities. Sometimes they were stored in jars, sometimes dried, and sometimes turned into wax models. Each piece told a story about the fragile beginnings of life and the fascination humans have always held for the mysteries of the body. Collecting human oddities required patience, skill, and careful observation. Specimens were cleaned meticulously, stored safely, and documented thoroughly. Every label, every note, was an attempt to understand life and preserve knowledge. The collectors were not merely interested in the strange. They were seeking wisdom from the human form, marveling at its complexity and diversity. Even objects that today seem grotesque or eerie were, in their time, objects of study, reverence, and quiet fascination. Some collectors combine human and animal specimens, seeking patterns across nature. A malformed hand next to a rare bird's claw, or a peculiar skull beside an unusual shell, could offer lessons in symmetry, growth, and adaptation. These comparisons, though strange to modern eyes, reflect a deep desire to understand the world and its many forms of life. Observing both human and non-human oddities side by side, the collector might meditate on life itself, its fragility, its beauty, and its infinite variety. Through these preserved specimens, we glimpse the curiosity of past civilizations. They remind us that the human body has long been a source of wonder, study, and reflection. By handling, observing, and recording each detail, these collectors honored life in its many forms. They held fragile reminders of mortality and marvel, capturing moments that might otherwise have been lost to time. Even in quiet observation, there is a sense of connection, a shared fascination that spans centuries. In the end, these preserved human oddities tell stories not just about the body, but about the human spirit. They reveal patience, reverence, and the timeless desire to understand life in all its forms. Through careful preservation, meticulous study, and thoughtful observation, the collectors of old remind us that curiosity can be gentle, patient, and deeply meditative. Even objects that seem strange, unusual, or unsettling hold lessons about humanity, continuity, and the wonder of living beings. Section 13. Fascination with the Dead. Preserved bodies in rituals and science. Across the centuries, humans have held a deep fascination with the dead. This fascination was expressed in many ways, from careful burial practices to the preservation of bodies for study or ritual. In some societies, preserved bodies were seen as bridges between the living and the spiritual world, while in others, they were sources of knowledge about life, disease, and anatomy. Observing and preserving the dead required patience, respect, and a careful hand. Each body, each fragment, was treated as a lesson, a story, and sometimes a relic of both history and mortality. In ancient Egypt, the practice of mummification provides one of the most famous examples of body preservation. The process was long, detailed, and precise. Embalmers removed internal organs, treated them with oils and resins, and carefully wrapped the body in linen. The goal was not only to honor the deceased, but also to preserve the body for the journey into the afterlife. The mummies were often accompanied by amulets, jewelry, and small objects to assist in the journey, each carefully placed and meaningful. This attention to detail reveals a deep respect for the body and a belief in its importance even after death. Mummification was not limited to Egypt. In the Andean region of South America, the Chinchorro people, thousands of years ago, developed sophisticated methods of preserving their dead. They removed the flesh, reinforced the skeleton with sticks, and covered the body with clay. These mummies often retained lifelike features, even intricate details of hair and facial expressions. In Japan, Buddhist monks practiced self-mummification, meditating for years while gradually reducing body fat until death and preservation were achieved naturally. In each case, the act of preservation was slow, deliberate, and imbued with cultural and spiritual significance. In medieval Europe, preserved bodies sometimes served educational purposes. Medical schools sought opportunities to study anatomy, but cultural and religious restrictions often limited access. When permitted, cadavers were treated with care, dissected methodically, and sometimes preserved with salt or alcohol for repeated observation. Students would quietly study the body, noting the placement of organs, the texture of muscles, and the alignment of bones. Through careful documentation, they could learn about illness, injury, and the variations of the human form. Even when the preservation was temporary, the respect for the body was evident in the careful handling and detailed recording. Preserved bodies also played roles in religious rituals. Saints' relics, especially in medieval Europe, were treated with extraordinary care. Bones, hair, and even mummified remains were displayed in ornate reliquaries, often gilded or enshrined with precious metals and gems. Pilgrims would visit these relics quietly, often leaving offerings or prayers. The preserved body, in this context, was both a symbol of holiness and a physical object that connected the living with the sacred. The attention to cleaning, positioning, and safeguarding these remains shows a consistent human desire to honor and preserve, even when death had occurred. In addition to religious and medical preservation, some cultures kept preserved bodies for social or political purposes. Egyptian and Roman leaders occasionally preserved their own or their predecessors' remains to demonstrate power, continuity, or divine favor. These bodies were often displayed temporarily in public ceremonies, treated with oils, and wrapped carefully. In Asia, certain preserved monks or leaders were revered as living symbols, maintained with ritual care for decades or even centuries. Across time, the act of preserving the dead was never casual. It was deliberate, respectful, and deeply meaningful. Collectors and scholars of the Renaissance took this fascination further. Cabinets of curiosity often included preserved human and animal specimens, sometimes with intricate labels and detailed illustrations. The preserved bodies were tools for observation and meditation, prompting viewers to reflect on the fragility of life and the passage of time. Even the most unusual or grotesque specimens were treated with care. Students and scholars would spend long hours observing, sketching, and writing detailed notes, recording the smallest features of bones, skin, and organs. This careful study reveals the patience and dedication of those who sought knowledge through preservation. Some preserved bodies were also preserved by accident. Natural mummification occurs in dry or cold environments, sometimes leaving bodies remarkably intact. Observers would take note of these naturally preserved remains, studying their clothing, posture, and even hair. In peat bogs in northern Europe, for example, bog bodies were discovered with skin, hair, and even internal organs intact. These discoveries fascinated scholars and lay people alike, offering insight into ancient rituals, diet, and lifestyle. Each body, whether preserved deliberately or naturally, became a window into a world long past. Through centuries of preservation, observation, and study, humanity has shown a remarkable curiosity and reverence for the dead. Every preserved body tells a story of culture, belief, medicine, or devotion. The care taken, whether in wrapping linen, storing in jars, or placing in ornate reliquaries, demonstrates patience, respect, and wonder. In quiet observation, there is a meditation on life itself, on the fleeting nature of time, and on the eternal fascination humans have held for their own mortality. Each preserved body, silent and still, carries lessons for those willing to look closely. In the end, preserved bodies, relics, and oddities from history offer both knowledge and reflection. They remind us that across centuries, humans have sought to understand life, honor the dead, and preserve what is fragile. In every careful wrapping, every detailed sketch, and every quiet study, there is reverence, curiosity, and contemplation. The fascination with the dead is a gentle thread that connects generations, cultures, and civilizations, inviting us to observe patiently, learn quietly, and reflect deeply on the delicate and intricate nature of human life. Section 14. Cultural beliefs and superstitions about preserved bodies. Across time and cultures, preserved bodies have inspired both awe and caution. Many societies developed beliefs and superstitions about the dead, particularly those whose bodies remained intact after death. These beliefs shaped rituals, burial practices, and even daily life. People often approached preserved bodies with both curiosity and reverence, aware of their connection to spiritual forces. Ancestral power or mystical energy. In some cases, preservation was seen as a blessing, a sign of holiness. In others, it was considered an omen, a mark of misfortune or danger. In ancient China, the preservation of certain individuals carried spiritual significance. The Taoist practice of creating immortal bodies involved careful dietary regimes, meditation, and herbal treatments, sometimes resulting in natural mummification. When a master was preserved in this way, followers considered the body sacred. It became a focus for prayer, meditation, and ritual offerings. They believed that the preserved body could transmit wisdom, blessings, or protection to the living. These rituals were gentle, deliberate, and often accompanied by quiet reflection. In medieval Europe, superstitions surrounded the intact bodies of saints or unusual corpses. If a body did not decompose as expected, it was frequently interpreted as a sign of divine favor or miraculous power. Relics were displayed in churches and monasteries, carefully washed and wrapped in rich fabrics. Pilgrims traveled long distances to view these bodies, leaving offerings and performing small rituals in silent reverence. The faithful believed that proximity to these preserved bodies could cure ailments, bring blessings, or even provide protection from evil forces. The preserved body was not merely an object, it was a vessel of spiritual significance. In Japan, Buddhist monks who undertook self-mummification were surrounded by layers of superstition and ritual. The preserved bodies were thought to embody spiritual enlightenment and discipline. Communities maintained quiet respect for these remains, leaving offerings of incense or small tokens of appreciation. They believed that the mummified monks could offer guidance to the living and serve as intercessors between the earthly and spiritual realms. Observing the preserved body was a slow, contemplative practice meant to teach patience and reflection. Even in less formal contexts, preserved bodies inspired careful customs. Among the indigenous people of South America, naturally preserved bodies were sometimes seen as bridges to ancestors. Communities would place offerings near the remains, speak softly, or conduct small ceremonies to honor the life once lived. They were mindful of touching or moving the bodies, believing that disrespect could invite misfortune. This sense of reverence created an environment of quiet attentiveness, where the preserved body became a reminder of both mortality and connection. The fascination with preserved bodies was also tied to medicine and science. Renaissance scholars sometimes treated these remains with equal parts curiosity and superstition. They would study the body to understand illness, anatomy, and the effects of time. Yet even then, there were rules, rituals, and careful observation. Some believed that improper handling could bring bad luck or spiritual harm. Others whispered that the preserved body might transmit knowledge or even qualities of strength and endurance to those who approached respectfully. Each body became a bridge between knowledge, belief, and imagination. In many cultures, there was a consistent idea that the dead could influence the living. Preserved bodies were not passive objects. They carried energy, memory, and power. People developed rituals of respect to ensure that this power remained beneficial rather than harmful. Some societies used chants, incense, or special prayers. Others created protective enclosures, ensuring that only certain individuals could approach. These practices created a rhythm of quiet attention, contemplation, and care, emphasizing patience and reverence over haste or curiosity. Across continents, preserved bodies were also linked to storytelling. Families, communities, and religious groups passed down accounts of miraculous preservation or unusual decay. These stories were shared slowly, often at quiet gatherings or during ceremonial occasions. The preserved body became a living narrative, connecting generations through observation, ritual, and storytelling. People were invited to reflect on life, death, and the mysteries that lay between, all in the presence of the preserved remains. This quiet reflection reinforced cultural values and emphasized careful observation. In conclusion, cultural beliefs and superstitions about preserved bodies reveal a universal human tendency to approach death with both respect and fascination. Across time, societies have treated preserved bodies as objects of spiritual, medical, and moral significance. People developed rituals, maintained care, and approached the dead with quiet observation. From sacred mummies to relics of saints, from self-preserved monks to naturally preserved corpses, each body conveyed lessons about life, death, and the unseen. In the calm attention paid to these remains, there is a meditation on impermanence, patience, and the delicate balance between reverence and curiosity. These preserved bodies, silent yet profound, remain enduring reminders of human wonder, care, and respect for the mysteries of mortality. Section 15. Lessons and Reflections from Preserved Bodies. Preserved bodies in all their forms offer quiet lessons about human life and culture. They are not only physical remains, but windows into the beliefs, values, and practices of the people who cared for them. Across history, the careful attention given to these bodies shows a desire to connect with the past, understand mortality, and honor the lives once lived. The presence of a preserved body often encouraged reflection, mindfulness, and respect. People approached them slowly, spoke softly, and performed rituals with measured gestures, reinforcing a calm and contemplative atmosphere. In many cultures, preserved bodies inspired communities to consider the passage of time. Observing a body that had resisted decay prompted thoughts about impermanence and the cycles of life and death. Ancient Egyptians, for example, used mummification not only to preserve the body, but also to maintain a spiritual connection between the living and the deceased. They believed that a carefully prepared body could house the soul, allowing it to continue its journey in the afterlife. Families would spend days preparing the body, using oils, linen, and gentle rituals, all performed with quiet care. The slow, deliberate process encouraged reflection and patience, inviting participants to contemplate the fragility and value of life. In medieval Europe, relics of saints and holy figures were preserved as symbols of spiritual guidance. Communities approached these remains with reverence, often making pilgrimages to visit them. The bodies, sometimes incorrupt, were carefully displayed in churches, surrounded by candles, incense, and offerings. People whispered prayers, left small gifts, or performed subtle gestures of devotion. The preserved body became a focal point for meditation, encouraging visitors to slow down, observe quietly, and connect with a sense of sacredness. It reminded them that life is fleeting, yet memory, faith, and care can endure beyond death. In Asia, Self-mummified monks provided a similar invitation to contemplation. Monks would follow strict diets, meditative practices, and rituals to prepare their bodies. After death, their remains were preserved in carefully maintained shrines. Followers believed that the monks' discipline allowed their essence to remain present, offering guidance to the living. Visitors would approach respectfully, often leaving incense or chanting softly. The preserved body was a teaching tool, reminding people to cultivate patience, mindfulness, and spiritual awareness. Each ritual, each gesture, emphasized calmness and quiet reflection. Even in less formal contexts, preserved bodies encouraged reflection on mortality and care. In South America, naturally preserved bodies were treated with respect, often placed in small ceremonial spaces and accompanied by offerings. Communities recognized that touching or disturbing the remains could have consequences. Observing the bodies provided a gentle reminder of human vulnerability and the importance of respectful behavior. The quiet presence of the preserved body encouraged thoughtful observation, careful movements, and an awareness of both life and death. It fostered a sense of connection across generations and time. The fascination with preserved bodies also intersects with science, medicine, and curiosity. Scholars in Renaissance Europe studied mummies and relics to understand anatomy, disease, and preservation. Yet even scientific observation was accompanied by caution. There was a careful balance between curiosity and respect, with protocols developed to avoid desecration or spiritual harm. The preserved body became a bridge between knowledge and reverence, inviting thoughtful reflection rather than hasty investigation. Scholars often recorded their observations slowly, taking time to describe details and speculate on processes, all in a quiet, contemplative manner. Preserved bodies also offer lessons about cultural diversity. Different societies developed unique techniques and rituals for handling the dead. From embalming and mummification to careful wrapping, placement, and ritual observances, each practice reflected local beliefs, resources, and philosophies. Observing these bodies provides insight into how humans across time managed grief, honored memory, and connected with the unseen. The deliberate and patient handling of preserved bodies encourages the modern observer to slow down, notice details, and reflect on both historical practices and human values. As we approach the end of this narration, it is important to pause and consider the quiet lessons offered by preserved bodies. They speak of patience, care, and reverence. They remind us of the fleeting nature of life and the enduring impact of memory and ritual. In the calm observation of these bodies, people have found solace, inspiration, and understanding. Even today, studying preserved remains can evoke a sense of wonder, respect, and mindfulness. Outro. Now, as our journey comes to a gentle close, take a moment to breathe slowly and relax. Imagine the quiet spaces where these preserved bodies rest, surrounded by calm, reverent care. Let your mind reflect on the patience, attention, and thoughtfulness of people across centuries. Their respect for life, death, and memory can remind us to cherish the present, to move slowly, and to observe the world with gentle attention. Soon, this narration will end, and you may let yourself drift into calm reflection or sleep. Carry with you the quiet lessons of history, the stillness of preserved moments, and the sense of connection across time. May your mind rest gently, and may your sleep be deep, calm, and peaceful. Good night.